Although our soldiers fired upon them at 25 paces, they continued their march without replying. Every regiment filed past without saying a word or slackening its pace for a moment. The streets were filled with dying and wounded, but not a groan was heard, for they were forbidden. You might have said that we were firing at shadows. At last we charged the Russian soldiers with the bayonet, and only when we pierced them could we be convinced that we were dealing with men. Welcome back to the channel, and today's video on Napoleonic basics will be focusing on that most solid and implacable of Napoleon's enemies, the Russian infantrymen. The Russian army of the Napoleonic Wars underwent three major reorganisations. The first carried out in 1796, the second after their disastrous defeat at the Battle of Austerlitz in 1805, and the third, which was finished just in time for the invasion of Russia in 1812. The armies we're going to be looking at today are going to be from the 1812 onwards period. So these will be the armies that fought at Smolensk, Borodino, and then chased Napoleon in his retreat from Moscow all the way back to Paris. What we can see on the tabletop here are two battalions of the Pavlov Musketeer Regiment. That's a line regiment, although it did eventually become a Grenadier Regiment. Don't worry about that too much. We'll talk about that later. And if you're not sure what I mean by the term battalion, then if you go back and watch my video on the British Infantry, and there'll be a link to that in the description, then I go through all the terms there, company, battalion, regiment, and explain them in greater detail. So what we can see is two line battalions. The first battalion is on the right of the picture, and you can tell that because their flags are the coloured flag of the regiment and the white flag. So if I can just move it around there to see. So the first battalion would take the white flag, and that was very similar. There you go, got it focused in there. And that was very similar to the King's colour for the British or the eagle for the French. That was where the soul of the regiment lie. The other battalion carries two of the regimental colours. So there we are, we focus on there, that's nice. So that denotes that they are, in this case, the 3rd Battalion. Now, as with the British and French and most other regiments in the Napoleonic Wars, they were made up of a number of battalions. Now, the Russians had 3 battalions in their line regiments. It's a little bit confusing, this, so stick with me if you can. The 1st Battalion was their 1st Field Battalion, and as you can see, they carried the white flag and one of their regimental colours. The 2nd Battalion, similar to the British, was their Home Depot Battalion, so they would stay back, in this case in Pernov, and they would be recruiting and training their men. I'm going to talk about Russian methods of recruitment later. It's something I missed in the British video, so I might go back and do another British video on that later. So they would do the training and recruitment back at the depot, and then the 3rd Battalion would be the 2nd Field Battalion. So it's a bit confusing. So the 1st and 3rd Battalions would be in the field, and as you can see here on the left of the picture, the 3rd Battalion would carry 2 of the same flags. You will probably hear me in the course of this video and in future videos talking about the 2nd Battalion. Now this is where the confusion comes in. Sometimes they were referred to as the 2nd Field Battalion because they were the 2nd Battalion who would actually go into the field. So it's a bit confusing. The main thing to remember is there were 3 battalions in a Russian regiment, and the 1st and the 3rd one went into battle. As you can see, I've now formed that 1st Russian battalion into column of march. Very similarly to the British, the Russians weren't really that keen on having super complicated or innovative formations, and they would stick with pretty much the standards. So this is column of march, used for manoeuvring to the battlefield, along roads, things like that. In black powder, it gives you an extra bonus to your command, exactly the same as I mentioned in the British video. So it's particularly good for manoeuvring troops around. It is, however, incredibly vulnerable to attack, and they certainly wouldn't fight in this formation. The formation they would fight in would be the 3 deep line. Now, because of the way I've based my figures, they're only going to be 2 deep, but I'll just pause the video while I arrange them into line. Okay, so I've reorganized them now, and they're now in their formation in order to either repel the French columns or to lead a bayonet charge against them. The Russians were very keen on bayonet charges. They were one of the few armies in the world at the time who actually did bayonet drill. There was an old Russian saying, which is, the bullet is a fool, the bayonet is a hero. And it was often decided by Russian generals that an absolute assault was the best thing to do. It added to the reputation of the Russians as being quite a ferocious enemy. And it also helped to make sure that the Russians stayed together and were very aggressive as often as possible. Even when they were in defensive positions like at Borodino, they would often allow the flèches to be taken by the French and then retake them with a bayonet point countercharge. So the formation you can see in front of you here is line. Now this, as with the British video I mentioned, allows maximum use of firepower. Now the Russians, along with pretty much everyone except the British, would be 3 men deep, and I've yet to really see a set of rules that talks about the benefits of that. The British, like in black powder, they get a steady line. They often get a bonus for only being in 2 ranks, but it being in 3 ranks also has its advantages. It gives you much more resilience, because when a guy dies, you only lose a third of your fire, 1 in 3 of your firepower, whereas in the British it's 1 in 2. So it's quite a big change there. And that third line also allows to have that bit extra momentum when you're going to do that bayonet charge. So we can see a Russian battalion in all its glory there. Who made up a Russian battalion? Well, it was the Russian peasantry. When Tsar Alexander took the throne, he was the king of by far the largest population on earth at the time. Nearly 50 million men. And the Russians had a feudal system still. The men who would be recruited were peasants. They were serfs, and they were the property of their landowner. What would often happen is they had a subscription. Oh no, they didn't. A third benefit to being in 3 ranks is it allows you to sort out the troops and put them in the position that's best for them individually. So the bravest, the rashest, the most foolhardy, one could say, would be in the front rank. The most experienced, the wisest, would be in the rear rank. With those with, shall we say, suspect motivations would go in the middle. And it would mean that they couldn't go forward. Well, they could go forward. That was the best place for them to go. But they certainly couldn't go backwards because the more experienced Russian veterans would stop them. So that's a Russian line battalion. Now, that's pretty much the 2 formations that the Russians used. As with all other nations, they, of course, use the square. But I will be doing an entirely separate video just focusing on the square. So I'm not going to discuss that here today. So what we've looked at here is a line battalion. What I'm going to talk about now is the other part of a Russian battalion, which were the Grenadier companies. So I'm just going to pause the video here and then replace that with a Converged Grenadier company. Okay, so here are 2 companies of Grenadiers. Now, each musketeer battalion would have a Grenadier company who were made up of the biggest, the toughest, the strongest men. And they would always be taken from their parent battalions in battle and put into what's called a Converged Grenadier company. Now, they were used as shock troops. They could either be used to bolster the line if there was enemy breakthrough or it looked like the Russians were wavering a little bit, or they could be used to exploit any gaps that had been caused in the French lines and smash on through. Now, there's two different types of grenadiers in the Russian army. There's the unit that you can see here, and that's what's called a Converged Grenadier Battalion. So what that is the Grenadier Company of the 1st Battalion and the Grenadier Company of the 3rd Battalion would be put into their separate formation and usually put into a separate brigade as well. So they were sort of part of their battalions for administrative purposes, but for purposes of anything practical, they were an independent unit. As you can see, my unit here doesn't have a standard. Now, that was fairly common. They didn't have a standard that was specific to them, but they would occasionally take the white standard of the 1st Battalion, mainly because being the biggest, toughest fighters of the battalion, people couldn't stop them. It was literally that. It was literally that. Yeah, what are you going to do about it, basically? So this is the kind of unit that I would put on the battlefield to represent a converged battalion. I don't use a flag in them because it helps them stand out. There was another type of Russian infantry, though, called a Grenadier Battalion. Now, they were made up of men, again, just like the Grenadier companies, who were the biggest, the strongest, and they would always operate together. Again, they would form a reserve, an elite unit that could be used to bolster or break through. And how I'd put that on the tabletop is I'd take away a base of musketeers, and then I would add their regimental colours. Now, in this case, we can see they've got the white flag and their regimental flag. So this would make it the 1st Battalion of the Little Russia Grenadier Regiment. Those colours are for the Little Russian Regiment. So I'll just get a bit of a close-up on there. There we go. So we can see their white flag and their coloured flag. And these guys, certainly in black powder, are a lot better than the Russian line. As well as having tough fighter, they also have the elite 4+ special rule, which means that it's incredibly hard to disorder them. They're always going to be able to get to that place that they need to be to either exploit that breakthrough or try and plug that gap. So that's the second type of Russian infantry I wanted to talk about. As they also have the elite Grenadier regiments as well. So I'm just going to pause the video here and I'll set those guys up. So here we can see what is undoubtedly one of my favourite regiments of the entire Napoleonic Wars, the Pavlov Grenadiers. Now, like I said about the Converged Infantry Grenadiers and the Grenadier Battalions, there's kind of a hierarchy of Grenadier. You have the Converged Grenadiers at the bottom. They're still good. You then have the Grenadier Battalions, and now you have the Guard Grenadier Battalions. Now, these guys are, as I say, they're one of my absolute favourite units of the whole Napoleonic Wars. I'm just going to bring the command stand a little bit closer. In fact, I'm going to zoom in on those guys. So, hang on. Now, they wore the mitres, which were very common previous to this period. They were brought in the Russian army by Tsar Paul I in his reforms of 1796. And all Grenadier regiments were ordered to get rid of them, except the Pavlovsk Grenadiers, who wore them as a battle honour. The front of them was brass, and in one occasion they took a lot of enemy fire, and they refused permission to hammer the dents out of the brass, because that was considered to be almost like a battle honour to have your helmet dented by French musket balls. So the Pavlov Grenadiers, they are among the absolute best infantry regiments of the Russian army. Almost comparable to the French Old Guard, certainly comparable to the Middle Guard, and much, much better than the Young Guard. These guys, not only did they have the physical strength and capabilities of the best of Russia, but they also had the aggressive attacking spirit, the ideology that the bayonet was the true hero that would save Mother Russia. These guys are, without doubt, in my top 5 Napoleonic regiments. I absolutely love the Pavlov Grenadiers. So that's enough of me gushing on them. I've got one more type of Russian infantry unit to show you. There is another one, which I will briefly talk about, but I don't have any figures of those ones. So I'm going to whisk off the Pavlov Grenadiers, and we'll discuss the final type of Russian infantrymen. So the final type of Russian infantry I'm going to talk about today is the Opolcheny, or Opolcheny. Anyone who speaks Russian, I apologise for my mangling of the language there. So I'm going to refer to them as militia, because I know how to pronounce that. These guys were raised from the people. They were very rarely trained. The ones that you see here have all got muskets. That's not necessarily guaranteed either. They may have gone with sharpened bits of wood. Pitchforks were said to be a particularly good thing to take with you. Swords, anything like that. Literally any weapons that they could get hold of. You can see in the unit I've got here, I've given them a flag with St. Michael on. At the Battle of Smolensk, there was a tapestry of St. Michael, and they used that as a flag in the battle there. And they're led by an Orthodox priest, because why not? I thought he was a very cool figure. The figures I've actually done there are Warlord Prussian Landwehr. I've sculpted some beards onto. I'm not going to do too many close-ups of them because they have variable quality, shall we say. And they represent the St. Petersburg Militia. One of the big things with Russian militias is that they would wear pretty much what their local dress was. So this is St. Petersburg one. The Moscow militia would wear a similar-ish uniform, but that would be a grey. And instead of having those sort of flat caps, they would have tall, almost like priest hats. That's quite an interesting look that they've got going on. But each area would be responsible for raising their own militia. And they were literally just people dragged from the land, given a form of weapon, perhaps, or they brought their own with them, and they would be sent to the enemy as well. Similarly to the Russian line, though, they had the same belief in Mother Russia, in the sacredness of their cause. They believed that St. Michael was watching over them. So they would be a good unit morale-wise. Effectiveness on the battlefield, variable. Let's put it politely like that. So that's covers off all the different types of Russian units I want to talk about today. There is another type that we haven't discussed called Jaegers. I'm going to do a separate video on light infantry of the different armies of the Napoleonic Wars, which I didn't really cover the British light infantry too much either. So that's going to be in a separate video. So Jaegers are out there. Don't think I've forgotten them, but they'll be covered in a separate video. So now we've talked about the different types of Russian infantry, I wanted to have just a quick conclusion with how, in my opinion anyway, their historical actions can be best represented on the battlefield by any Russian commander. So the Russians had an extensive playbook for their infantry, really, which consisted of three main approaches. The first one being to assault the enemy, the second one being to assault the enemy, and the third one to be, if they couldn't do the first two, then they would pretty much assault the enemy, was pretty much what they did. It should be heavy lines of regular infantry regiments, or battalions rather, going forward. And behind them should be either the combined Grenadiers or a Grenadier Brigade, made up of Grenadier regiments, or militia as well. So, you know, ideally you'd have the Grenadiers, but maybe you'll only have one brigade of those. So the rest of the reserve is going to have to be made up out of the militia. Now, something that we haven't really talked about today, because it's not Russian infantry, is Russian artillery. They had a huge belief in having heavy artillery, and I mean heavy artillery. 24-pounders were not uncommon, and they would just murderously fire in front of the advancing Russians. The idea being to almost blast a hole in the enemy through which the infantry units could then pour. Didn't always work, but it certainly inflicted heavy casualties in battles like Borodino, where the artillery were dug in. So, heavy infantry assaults, In Black Powder, they have Tough Fighter, which gives them a much better hand-to-hand rating than they have shooting. They also have that 4th point of stamina, which means that the French have got to really go some to stop them getting in. Unfortunately, to balance that out, they have the lacking initiative special rule, which means they have to be ordered to charge. So while it's comparatively easy to get them into a position where they can charge, getting that final charge in, not so easy. Also, getting a coordinated charge in is even harder. And that perfectly fits with how they would operate historically. Those combined arms were difficult for all armies. The Russians in particular had real difficulty getting combined brigade operations going together. So I hope you've enjoyed the video today. It's been much longer than the last one. Please comment, like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. And I'll see you next time. Thank you very much. Goodbye.